I so appreciated that chant earlier. I haven't heard that for so long. It just brought back a world of memories. Just wonderful. Thank you for these beautiful songs, and welcome on this 4th of July weekend. I have to say, Storm is back. Yay! Say hi to, oh. We are so glad to see you. We are so glad to see you, and thank you for bringing him here. You know, I found this talk pretty challenging, the multicultural America. The energy of it was pulling me to talk about our differences and how wonderful that is. And yet at the same time, as a metaphysical minister, I was pulled to talk about our oneness and how important that is. So we're going to do a little bit of both, I think. It's almost like a paradox. We're one, yet we're separate. We're created by the one of God in God's image, and yet we're all different. Does that ever feel odd to you? It does to me sometimes. It's like a coin. If I could mint a coin that would have, we're all one on one side and we're all individual on the other, and every day you could flip it and just see, how do I want to feel today? But anyway, I thought I better get some help from the wise ones, so I'm tapping Jesus, Buddha, Black Elk, and Ernest Holmes this morning to help me with this, because it was a bit of a challenge. You know, when I grew up, my uncles, we'd often get together with family, and my uncles would see us rowdy kids, and one of my uncles would say, "Oh, you're just being Dutch." I still today don't know what that means. And then at other times they'd say, "That's the Irish coming out in you." And so I didn't really know what they meant. All I knew is that they traveled during the war, and they probably met a lot of different ethnic cultures, and they probably thought it was funny. I don't know. It never dawned on me. Because our family name was Danzig, which I thought was German, and I looked it up on Google, and it's Polish. Who am I? And my maiden name was MacIver. Now, that's Irish and Scot. And yet my heart, if you came into my bedroom, is with Native Americans. It's an interesting thing. I just relish that part of me that was probably some other lifetime ago. So about a year ago, I got my DNA tested with this group 23andMe, and it said, well, actually, you're 83% English and Northern European. It's all a bit of a blur. But so today, the values I embrace are oneness, our oneness with you, my oneness with you, my oneness with the community. Ernest Holmes wrote that Buddha, Jesus, and other spiritual leaders understood that the universe had to be one or it couldn't hold together. I believe that. A house divided cannot stand. You know, today we observe many countries that are having this issue as well as of our own. How diverse are we? How separate are we? And are we going to stand as one on that? So Nancy Renard loaned me this wonderful CD a couple weeks ago, Conversations with God, Volume 4, Neale Donald Walsch. And Walsch asks God, what is the most important thing I can do to help humanity? And I thought, ooh, this is going to be good. And he said, just stay awake. Okay? But what he meant was share the truth about our oneness. Share the truth about our heritage as individual creations of the one by walking, talking, acting, speaking in that language that we're learning here. And those that are interested will ask about that. I have had people go, what is it about you that I just wish I had more of or knew more of or felt more of? And so that's what it means to stay awake. Buddha said, light your own lamp, and then the lives of others will be illuminated effortlessly. Effortlessly. So we have a personal power within us that when we use these teachings, when we understand the spiritual nature of our lives, we can help illuminate others, and that's what God was telling Neale Donald Walsch. Stay awake. This is the greatest gift we can give to the world today. This God consciousness that we call peace, power, beauty, and joy is also learning to live without fear, learning to tamper down the ego at times, to learn to live without jealousy or without hate. It always reminds me, Chris Johnson is the voice of God often here. It's There's only one life. That life is God's life. That life is perfect, and that life is my life now. So simple, but so profound. And if you've been involved in the center for very long, you know how profound a teaching this is. And you can't just take 3 classes at once and get it. Isn't that the truth? You can't. It takes time. And so we honor the progress we all make as we learn these spiritual truths, and we learn how to think more positively, and we learn how to channel those energies to make life more the way we want it to be. And Sue and I love those times when someone comes to us and they said, I got it, the great aha showed up. And now you'll never forget, because we'll remind you. We'd love to remind you that we really are all one. So Sue knew I was struggling with this topic a little bit, so she loaned me this book. And it was about practices for lasting peace. And the author said, in order to stop the cycle of war, we have to look beneath what's really going on. We have to understand the motives people have. The motives for accumulating material things. I've got more than you've got. The motives behind criticizing other religions. And he said all those are based on selfishness, a sense of inferiority, but also ethnocentrism, which is how we evaluate other cultures based on our own, as if ours is the only right one. It's common for communities to have shared values. You know, I like to hang out with people who share my values, although that's a little bit limiting in times of understanding what's going on in the world. And I remember a fellow who moved up here some time ago, and he was in the Bay Area, and all he was doing for several years was selling bounce houses to families. Because when one person got one on the street, the neighbor had to have it, and the neighbor had to have it, and the neighbor had to have it. And he got very wealthy selling bounce houses to people who wanted to keep up with the Joneses. The difference between the haves and the have-nots in some circles of our society really deepens the divisions between people. So we're looking for spiritual transformation, self-transformation. I can't transform you, only you can. But if you're open to seeing the beauty of this being human and being a soul on a journey, it's amazing. You know, I forgot, and I remembered the other day that Dr. Andrea Azevedo studied anthropology in college. Now, that's not something I would have ever thought of. I was more into forestry and sawmill management, believe it or not. But she was an anthropology student, and you know, in anthropology, they have a wide range of things that they do. They study human history. They can trace Homo sapiens back 8 million years. That's a long time to be migrating around the planet, a long time. And they study evolutionary development, and they study genetic diversity. And they're trying to understand how we evolved, how our brains evolved, how our cells evolved, how our nervous system evolves. And it must be fascinating to learn the differences in the different cultures as Homo sapiens traveled around the world and settled in so many different places. Well, I have a minister that I mentor, and in our philosophy, we mentor ministers until they get ordained, and then they're blessed to be whoever they want to be. But she's also a professional tour guide. And so when I talk to her every couple of weeks, she's been in the most fabulous places. I mean, all over the world. And she just returned from 8 days in South Dakota in the Black Hills. And she loves history. And so she always studies up on the history because some people travel just to get away, and she wants them to know about history and plants and animals and things like that. So she's a wonderful tour guide. Well, she took 23 people through the Black Hills of the Dakotas for 8 days. There were a lot of stories she told me about this trip, but I won't go there, but anyway. One of the stories she shared with them is the Black Hills betrayal. I don't know if that rings with you, but I didn't know the words Black Hills betrayal. And we could conjure up in our mind what it might have meant, but I think you're going to find this interesting because I Googled it and I learned a lot. And I don't want to pass on fake news, so I hope the story is correct. There was a group of people called the Arikara and they arrived in the Dakotas in the 1500s. They were followed by the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Kiowa, and the Pawnee, all showing up eventually in the Dakotas. Well, in the 1700s, the Lakota Sioux showed up, and they chased all the rest of them away, and they all went west. So the Sioux were major in the Dakotas. The Sioux then claimed the Black Hills for themselves. Well, from the earliest days of this country, when they were writing the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the federal government just didn't know what to do with all these tribes. They were unsure because they were so different. And in 1831, a court case called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the court decided that Indian tribes were not foreign nations or states, they were domestic dependent nations. As nations, they were not subject to the laws of the state. But the Constitution didn't provide the government with any guidelines on how to do this. They were another nation within our nation, but they weren't citizens. And so what the government ended up doing was signing a lot of treaties with these tribes because they were just not part of the regular way the nation developed that we know it. Well, you know, the American Civil War ended in 1865, and that was a big cultural clash in our country. And 3 years later, in 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed. It guaranteed Indian ownership to the Black Hills, but it only lasted 6 years. Here's an interesting piece of the story. When the Civil War ended, 1865, the government debt was 40 times what it was before the war. And now they were under Reconstruction, and that was a tremendous burden to the country. I was reading, and I couldn't find it twice, but I found it, that so many people lost limbs and were disfigured by the ammunition and the guns and the powder and the cannonballs. And they didn't have artificial limbs back then. So there was so much difficulty getting people back into working, getting people back healthy. And it was called now one of the darkest times in our history. Yeah, you know how it goes. In a very, very dark time, a little spark of light appears. And there was a group of elites that surfaced that were industrialists and railroad entrepreneurs. They had these ideas of industry and railroads. But their ideas were foiled 8 years later when on September 18th, 1873 was the big panic. Now, I didn't know that, the Panic of 1873. It was a worldwide panic, but in the United States, it started when banks who were funding the Northern Pacific Railway went bankrupt. That kicked off a 4-year depression in which 8,000 businesses, 156 railroads, and 400 banks went bankrupt. 1873. Thousands of people lost their jobs. It was a terrible time. But 1 year later, 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Guess who discovered it? General George Custer. Isn't that interesting? So we have all these desperate people. He had it printed in the New York newspaper, gold was discovered, and thousands of people went to the Black Hills. And what a clash of cultures, an incredible clash of cultures. The railroads quickly started building trains that went to the Black Hills from all the eastern cities. And we have today a lot of really ugly and shocking stories of those times, of the abuses that people put on one another, how people abused each other. And it was before the Civil War, during the Civil War, after that, during the Indian Wars, and a lot of those wounds have still not been healed. But in this turmoil, another spark, a man named Black Elk. He was a famous medicine man of the Lakota Sioux, and he was born 10 years before the Big Panic. And he was a cousin of Crazy Horse. And at the age of 12, he participated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And he was injured in the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. So much we can learn from people like him, had the country not been in such a panic. The translation of one of his most famous quotes is this. I'd like to read it. Peace comes from the souls of men when they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all its powers. And when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells the great spirit, Wankantaka, and that this center is really everywhere, it is within each one of us, right in the middle of all that. So what we see is that no matter how dark things look, hope does spring eternal. Because the other bright spark in the middle of 1800s is people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and many, many others who brought what we now call New Thought to light. And if you didn't know, our philosophy, Science of Mind, is a New Thought philosophy. And it's thanks to so many people who over the years include our dear Ernest Holmes, who wrote the book Science of Mind. So if you Google New Thought, here's what it's going to say. In general, New Thought is the belief that God or infinite intelligence is supreme, universal, and everlasting, that divinity dwells within each person, and that all people are spiritual beings. And the highest spiritual principle is loving one another unconditionally and teaching and healing one another, and that our mental states are carried forward into manifestation and become the experience of our daily life. Isn't this beautiful? I mean, it's what we teach. And yet it was sparked during the turmoil of the mid-1800s. Now, you can go back centuries and hear pieces of this, but this is what New Thought is called today. The interesting thing to other religions who try to proselytize and invite you in and become part of it is that these are not fighting beliefs. We don't fight about these. We don't go around trying to convert people. And we don't condemn other beliefs either. But we know as we experience these beliefs, we find a new level of love and acceptance for everyone. So it's the 4th of July weekend, and I'm celebrating oneness. I'll celebrate diversity, but boy, I love you as one. So I wanted to share a piece of a transcript from one of Ernest Holmes' radio shows in 1950 during the Korean conflict, which you know was one of the uglier wars that we were in. And I think it applies to today. And this talk won him an award from the Freedom Foundation, which I thought was interesting. So here's part of what he said. Leaders in our country and other countries have been asked that we pray for peace. For everyone realizes around the world that we are in a period of great crisis. The over-pessimistic are afraid that this crisis might lead to total world devastation. But those with hope don't feel that way. Rather, we should feel that this crisis can lead to something permanent and good, something which will make the world a better place in which to live. There seems to be two attitudes that we can assume. One is calmness, faith, and conviction, and the other is despair. Despair is unthinkable. Let each of us, in our own way, dedicate time, hope, spiritual conviction to the common cause of liberty and justice for all. Let's work without tiring and pray without ceasing. For something alive with meaning is taking place. Something vibrant with hope is happening. Something latent with the possibility of the future is being conceived, and it would be advisable for us to reread the Declaration of Independence and try to think of the meaning all over again, line by line and word by word. For it is here we find the specific and definite directions for working it all out. So that's your challenge for the week. So are multicultural differences more valuable than recognizing our oneness? I guess it depends on what side you're on or how you look at life. But as a minister, I'm really focused on oneness. Ernest Holmes wrote, as Damien so beautifully said, we exist in unity, but it does not mean uniformity. It means oneness of purpose. It means that what is best and safe for the majority without losing sight of each person and each location, and that we live without the tyranny of another. For there can be no individual self-preservation without preservation of it all. You know, we've been created in the image of perfection, as we talk about God's conscious awareness, peace, power, beauty, and joy. But we've been left alone to discover this for ourselves. That's what this great journey is about, and that's why this community of like-minded individuals pursues that self-transformation. And to me, this is the real freedom. And it's worthy of your contemplation this weekend as we celebrate July 4th. So let's do a prayer about that. I can pray without glasses. That's good. Oh. That we were created by the one infinite intelligence is just sometimes so hard to understand. And yet the air I breathe and the air that you breathe and the air the plants breathe, it's all one. It's all one energy. And it's transforming us cell by cell, word by word, talk by talk. The transformation of the self is the greatest place that we can place our attention this year in 2017. We look back at the past and we see the trials and tribulations of what it took to create what we have now. And we bless those people and we honor those people. We know how hard that was. And today we see the trials and tribulations all around us, and we know within that is a spark of newness, a spark of new level of awareness that is going to continue to transform our hearts, our minds, and our souls. So I trust in this process. I trust in the unfoldment of each one of us to understand our place in the universe, that we're never alone. We're always supported by that one. Thank you, Spirit, for the information here today that helped me feel empowered by the past and hopeful in the future. It's all one, and it's all okay, and so it is.